Fire Emblem is a series that loves its archetypes, but not every archetype is going to survive into the modern day. For its nearly 40-year run, some tropes have been routinely iterated on and made into reliable and interesting tools for storytelling and gameplay, while some show up just a few times before disappearing. So what separates the archetypes that become permanent from the ones that get left behind? In this video, I want to look at some of Fire Emblem's forgotten archetypes, why they worked, why they faded, and what it might take for intelligent systems to bring them back. And as always, if you enjoy Fire Emblem analysis like this, please like, comment, and subscribe. The first archetype I'll discuss is one of the series' most beloved, the White Wings. They're a trio of Pegasus Knights, usually sisters, whose dynamic tends to consist of one immature one standoffish one, and one motherly one. The original trio, Palla, Catria, and Est, appears in the first 3 Fire Emblem games. In FE1, they serve under Minerva and help her undermine Michaelis. In Gaiden, they have a side story of rescuing Est after she'd been captured by bandits, as is often the case in Gaiden. And in FE3, Palla and Catria help rescue Minerva from a coup while Est is caught up in Altea's invasion. I like the sense of progression present in their roles in the narrative, with them starting out as Minerva's soldiers but being the ones saving her by FE3. Also, love is a common subject for all 3 of them. With Est, her situation in Book 2 is a direct consequence of her relationship with Abel. Palla and Catria, meanwhile, both deal with unrequited love. Catria loves Marth while Palla loves Abel, both of whom are characters that already have a lover. There's no real resolution to these feelings, they just kinda have to move on. In the end, they're both able to continue their work regardless. This is a pretty downer way for their characters to end, but I think I like it. It feels more realistic than an ending where everyone magically gets what they want. I think the Arcanine White Wings are a really compelling set of characters, and it's not hard to see why they became such fan favorites. They have a clear dynamic, they're consistently relevant to the story, and they actually change over time, which was actually pretty novel in these old games. They start off as pretty basic soldiers but grow into heroes. On top of that, their shared focus on love gives them a unifying theme without making them feel identical. They really feel like a family with shared experiences but individual struggles. That gives them a level of cohesion that helps them stand out. FE6 gives us Shauna, Tate, and Yuno. There's no Minerva equivalent, so this time the trio was less tightly bound by a shared narrative role. Instead of knights under a shared banner, they're all mercenaries trying to make a living. Shauna is the young and cheerful one, and this time she's the first to join. She belongs to Deke's mercenary band and is treated like the baby of the group. Tate is the stern middle child with a bob. She joined Etruria as a mercenary and, for some godforsaken reason, can't be recruited by her own sister and is only convinced to defect by her boyfriend Klein. Yuno is the eldest and the only one to stay in Ilia, being imprisoned after Bern invaded. She even has some past relationships that work to give her roots in the world. She has her husband, the Knight Zealot, and an old friend, the enemy Knight Sigyn. This gives her a more storied feel than her sisters, which is fitting for the oldest one. While they're still clearly iterative of their Arcanine counterparts, I think the mercenary angle and the more fleshed out backstories helps the FE6 White Wings stand on their own. Losing that shared anchor in Minerva can make them feel less cohesive, but I think that's made up partly by their shared motivation for money. Though I don't really think there's anything to replace the shared theme of love that the original had. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it gives each of them more room to exist independently, however it does make the trio feel a bit less tightly knit than the originals. Next is FE7 with Florina, Fiora, and Farina. Being that this is a Lieb again, they have essentially the same backstory as the FE6 trio. All 3 of them are sisters from Ilia that rely on mercenary work. Florina is the first one you get and is pretty atypical. She doesn't fight for money, rather it's her friendship with Lyn that motivates her to fight. She's also incredibly meek for a mercenary, with her constantly doing that anime thing where she freaks out when anyone talks to her. Fiora takes on the role of the mature one. Before meeting us, she was on a mission from Pent when her whole platoon died on the Dread Isle. I like giving her this connection to a seemingly unrelated character. I think it makes the world feel more alive since there are bonds and backstories that you're not entirely privy to. As well, the Survivor's Guild storyline is really interesting and unique. You would expect Farina to be the terse middle child, but she's really nothing like that. She's much more tomboyish and even demands money for recruitment. Having your mercenary characters actually demand payment for their services is something I wish Fire Emblem did more often. As we'll find out, when FE7 tackles classic archetypes, it likes to add more individuality while still sticking to the core structure. Here, each sister feels more distinct with clear personal motivations that aren't obviously connected to one another. Similarly to FE6, this has the result of them feeling like a less cohesive unit than the Arcanine sisters, but I think the better fleshed out backstories and character arcs are worth it. The last White Wings are Vanessa, Cyrene, and Tana in FE8. They're not technically all sisters, but Cyrene and Vanessa are, and Tana says they're like sisters to her, so I'll take it. Vanessa is the first one who joins. She's the Knight of Frelia and the distant middle child of this trio, and I would be lying if I said I have anything more to say about her. Next is Tana, the youngest one. She's the Princess of Frelia, but doesn't really do much in the story. This is kind of unrelated, but early versions of Sacred Stones had a completely different design for La Rochelle, with her having the design that would eventually become Tana's. I've always interpreted this as Tana being a relatively late addition to FE8's story, which would help explain why she's the only royal who has barely any screen time across either route. Last is Cyrene, Vanessa's actual older sister and the motherly one of the group. She has some pretty good supports going to her backstory, but otherwise seems to be the most forgotten character in this entire archetype. While I don't dislike this trio, FE8's writing just doesn't really do it for me. Look at FE7. I feel like just through their introductory scenes, each knight leaves a strong impression of what their personality is like and hints at an interesting dynamic with their sisters. In contrast, I cannot imagine someone playing Sacred Stones and being eager to read Vanessa's supports. Also, by this point, the White Wings have gone from a tightly unified trio to something much looser and less defined. I think any kind of cohesion gradually falling apart may have influenced them away from bringing this archetype back out of fear it becomes stale. Gameplay-wise, all iterations of this archetype are pretty similar. The youngest has the lowest base stats, but the most potential to grow into a monster on the battlefield. The eldest has the highest base stats, but in exchange has the lowest potential, and the middle sister sits between them. This gives them all a unique feel in gameplay and helps them stand out in the player's mind despite being the same class. They also have a unique mechanic at their disposal, the triangle attack. With each of these trios, surrounding an enemy with them and attacking will result in guaranteed crits. Despite how broken that may sound, I find that it's more of a novelty than anything. Firstly, you don't often have access to it until near the end of the game. Secondly, it relies on you actually using all 3 Pegasi. Even though these are typically really good units, most people just don't like using 3 of the same class. As useful as it could be, I don't really find myself using it often. The exception to this is Gaiden, where all 3 join around the same time and are all incredibly strong. It's just broken in that game. Anyway, as for what's contributing to this archetype's dormancy, I think part of it is that there's really only so many ways you can repackage the same dynamics before it gets old. All 4 groups have the same, or at least similar, dynamics with one another. I think if it's brought back, that introducing new personalities to the archetype should be a top priority. I also think that the commitment it requires may make them hesitant to revisit it. It's rare for Fire Emblem games to have more than 3 Pegasus Knights, and if they want to include this archetype, that means all 3 need to be sisters. As a result, they'll all have similar backstories and motivations. There's not really a way to fix this since being sisters is core to the archetype, but I don't think it's impossible to give them more varied motivations for fighting like FE7 did. Overall, it's easy to see how this archetype has generated so many fan favorites. Just having appealing designs helps, but I think the pre-packaged character dynamics is the main reason. All 3 members of any given trio have distinct and memorable personalities that bounce off each other in fun ways. And this is a bit of a stretch, but I always believe that the 2 retainers, 1 royal structure that Fates goes for may have been inspired by this, or was at least trying to accomplish the same thing. You know, if you like one character from the trio, you're probably gonna like the other 2 as well. One of the most satisfying things Fire Emblem does is convey a character arc through gameplay, and one of the many ways it can do this is through the Wendel archetype. This is a promoted sage who joins your army and acts as a teacher to a younger mage. The main purpose of this archetype is to contrast the student with the teacher. The mage starts off weaker, but in most cases will eventually get stronger than the Wendel. This creates a strong gameplay arc where the student surpasses the master. The original is Wendel, a sage who joins you after his student, Merrick. The purpose of this iteration is to echo events in Arcanea's history and reinforce the game's themes about legacy. Wendel is a stand-in for Godo, while his students, Merrick and Arlen, are stand-ins for Maloa and Garneth. By convincing Arlen to give up his jealousy and work with Merrick instead of against him, he leads him away from the same destructive path that Garneth had led. As a unit, Wendel is really strong. He has crazy high speed, good weapon ranks, and in the remakes he gains access to reclass. This is a bit of an aside, but it's funny how for literally as long as the feature has existed, reclass has had the issue of it always being optimal to just run a full team of wyverns. Anyway, Gaiden and later Echoes tries a different approach with Noma. He's a sage who raised Celica and taught her magic. Having the Wendel be the protagonist's teacher is a cool idea, but he has so little presence in the story that it's hard to get anything out of their dynamic. Celica leaves on her pilgrimage right away, and Noma doesn't return until Chapter 4 in a very easily missed optional recruitment. After that point, he falls off the face of the earth, as NES characters are known to do. Noma is the weakest out of this archetype. He's not terrible, but you're certainly not wanting for mages at Celica's route. He's really only good as a heal bot. The next example is Set in FE5, who mentors Asvel. Having the mentor be a character you already knew from FE4 is cool. There's a really strong pathos to Set's character here. Back in Gen 1 of FE4, you were pairing up Ernest and deciding how Set would turn out, which makes you feel responsible for him. I know this sounds strange, but it's like you've raised him. Since this archetype is tied to powerful, experienced mages, seeing Set grow into that role is really satisfying. You were once guiding the next generation, and now you're watching those kids do the same. I think this highlights one of Fire Emblem's greater strengths, turning what could be simple gameplay mechanics into something that feels really personal. Set has the latest join time, but in exchange has the best stats. He starts with the holy weapon for Seti and will probably have the best combat in your army thanks to it. Next is Pent, who introduces a slightly different dynamic since he's essentially Urk's adopted father. Otherwise, this one's pretty straightforward. However, similarly to the White Wings of this game, FE7 puts more emphasis on making each character stand on their own. As a result, their relationship is less central. Pent is an Etrurian general with ties to Nevada, while Urk advances his training and makes a living as a bodyguard. In fact, Urk's death quote is the only place outside the supports that you'll learn of their connection. Pent is the most famous iteration of this archetype owing to how cracked he is. FE7 in general wasn't a game particularly interested in balancing its pre-promotes, and Pent is the most extreme example. Based on their average stats, a trained Urk would be roughly equivalent to Pent, except without the A rank and staves. And that's without considering that Pent joins with these stats for free, meanwhile getting Urk to that point before Pent joins will realistically take some favoritism from the player. You get Pent for no effort and he just automatically outclasses every other magic user in the game. Last is Saleh, who takes in the pupil Yuan. Rather than being a normal mage, Yuan is a trainee to make things more interesting in-game. I also find that their dynamic is a lot of fun. Yuan's a real scamp, so seeing the incredibly stern and self-serious Saleh try to rein him in is fun. Their contrasts also draw out the best in each other. Through dealing with Yuan, we see a softer Saleh, and through being given the opportunity to learn more about magic, we see a more determined Yuan. Gameplay-wise, while Saleh is quite strong, he's not a standout like Penter Wendell. He's more like Noma, being best used as a staff bot that can occasionally do good chip damage. And that's where the archetype ends, with it not having made an appearance since the Sacred Stones. It's a shame this archetype was left behind. I think it has a really compelling role as something that bridges gameplay and narrative. As for why it's gone, I think this mostly comes down to changing design priorities. Pre-promotes in general have become less emphasized as the series shifts towards growth units that the player can invest in. This makes sense since those project units tend to become more popular. Sages in particular have become rare, with only 2 new ones in the last 15 years. That said, I don't think this archetype is gone for good. There's still a lot of room here for interesting character dynamics, and in the past has given us some pretty popular characters. When Fire Emblem wants to tell a story through gameplay, this is one of its strongest tools. Next is the Axe Bros, one of Fire Emblem's oldest recurring archetypes and somehow one of its least memorable. They're usually a pair of early game fighters with slightly different stats. Over time, the series has found other ways to make them distinct, but the basic idea has stayed the same. The originals were Bord and Cord in FE1. Being that it's FE1, there is no personality with these guys. They belong to Ogma's mercenary company, and going by their endings, Bord is a woodcutter while Cord is just a dude. In fact, they wouldn't even get their first line of dialogue until their 4th appearance in the remake of this game's sequel. That game, FE12, did introduce supports, but really the only thing we learn is that they have a friendly rivalry. Narratively, these characters serve almost no purpose, but even from a gameplay perspective, their existence is confusing. Their main role would be to show that even units within the same class can differ in performance, but that purpose is already served by Cain and Abel. The Red and Green Cavalier duo is both more visually iconic and also just better as units. It leaves the Axe Bros feeling pointless when any point they had was already achieved better. They're still unremarkable in FE3 Book 1, and while reclassing gives them some possible niche in FE11 and 12, there's still nothing special. The archetype gets axed in Gaiden in Book 2 of FE3 since those games don't even have playable axe units. It returns in FE4, but this time it gets blended with another archetype entirely. The Aaron and Samson archetype describes a scenario where you're forced to choose between one of 2 units, with the one you didn't choose becoming permanently unavailable. FE4's Axe Bros are the Dozel brothers, Yukar and Yukarba. When you meet them in Chapter 6, both brothers express discontent with their father's actions, but Larse, or Krethna, can only recruit one of them, forcing the other to fight you. I find Yukarba a lot more likable as a character. He joins Selef's army because he disapproves of the Lopt sect and wants to make amends with the people of Isaac. In contrast, Yukar pretty much only cares about getting with Larse. This is also reflected in the way Larse talks about them, with her being happy to see Yukarba but being irritated by Yukar. Unfortunately, this happens to be one of the least balanced choices in the series. It's genealogy of the Horsey War, and only Yukar has a horse. I know Yukarba can sometimes have an easier time in the arena, but come on, dude. Overall though, incorporating them into this unique gameplay scenario is a nice way to make them feel more memorable. The next 4 iterations of the Axe Bros are relatively straightforward. In Thracia, we get Ozhin and Halvin, who actually take over the role typically held by the Cain and Abel. This is meant to convey how atypical Leaf's journey is, partially shown by him not having a retinue of knights to rely on and instead having to turn to these jackasses. They're also given a lot more backstory than their predecessors. In Chapter 1, there are villages that each of them can visit where they can talk with a family member and get unique weapons. This makes them feel like part of a living, breathing world. FE5 also uses a skill system to separate them mechanically. Ozhin has Wrath, while Halvin has Vantage. Halvin is a fine unit, but Ozhin absolutely laps the poor guy. Even without his personal killer hand axe to the Poogie, Wrath and follow-up critical ensures he can one-around everything. They also get to stay relevant in the plot for longer, since there are a few points where they can speak with other members of the Fianna Freeblades. This goes a long way in making them feel like actual people rather than just axe fighters A and B. Speaking of, in FE6 we get Wade and Lot, who don't really do anything new with this archetype. Their role as axe users in the mercenary band is already shared with the originals, and the ability to meet their family by visiting certain villages is borrowed from the Thracia duo. The support system introduced in FE6 does offer new avenues for character development, but the supports in FE6 are pretty wooden, so they still end up feeling like the most forgettable version of the archetype. They don't do much to stand out in gameplay either. FE6 removed the skill system, meaning Wade and Lot can only rely on their stats to stand out, and these certainly aren't stats you want to rely on. Binding Blade has infamously low hit rates and is particularly cruel to axe users. If the coin flip lands in your favor and they hit, they can do a good amount of damage. However, they're not especially fast, bulky, or mobile, and there are 4 other characters that are better candidates for the Fighter's Crest. FE7 puts in some effort to make its Axe Bros more distinct. Dortkus has a whole storyline in Lynn's campaign, and Barter was already playable in FE6, meaning each character has their own independently developed storylines. Consequently, these are the Axe Bros with the weakest connection, but I think it's for the best. They stand on their own a lot more than others, and I think that makes it easier to get attached to them individually. They do still have a relationship, being rivals, but I think their independence makes them more memorable. Gameplay-wise, it's basically the same story as FE6's, but less severe. They really don't stand out, but the improved hit rates makes using them less painful. FE8 gives us a more unusual spin with Ross and Garcia. They're a father and son duo introducing a new dynamic, and Ross also starts as a journeyman rather than a fighter, which gives him a more unique gameplay identity than stock Axeman number 11. Given that this was before Fire Emblem got it together and brought back the real skill system, I think this is a good enough way to shake things up. Garcia, though, is as unremarkable as the others. And that's where the archetype ends. So why, after all those iterations, did the axe bros disappear? I think this archetype faded for 3 main reasons. First, it never really had a unique gameplay niche. The series found other ways to show performance differences between same class units, and usually those differences were attached to better characters. Second, they are often bad. They peaked with Ocean, but otherwise range from terrible to mediocre. Further, the big bane with most axe users is accuracy. For new players especially, a unit that misses all the time is incredibly frustrating. It's one thing to be slow, it's one thing to be fragile, but if your unit is just constantly whiffing attacks, and it feels like you're wasting your time. Not only are you failing to make progress, but you're often being set back when they eat a counterattack. It's a feeling that'll turn a new player off the unit entirely. People also tend to like zero to hero storylines and gameplay, which I think is reflected in Ross being the most popular character from this archetype. The other characters just aren't exciting. For the most part, they start off mediocre and will remain as such. Third, despite appearing multiple times across the series, this archetype has failed to produce an especially popular character. Compare that to the White Wings, who have shown up less often but have multiple fan favorites. This isn't surprising for an archetype that consists mostly of adult men with pretty plain designs, so I don't know how likely it is that Fire Emblem brings the axe bros back. Across its 6 appearances, the archetype never fully justifies its purpose. They aren't seen as a core tenet of the series, aren't very popular, and just aren't that interesting. When the majority of characters in the archetype tend to end up as benchwarmers, it's hard to imagine there's going to be any strong desire either from the fans or internally at Intelligent Systems to bring them back. You know, there's a page on the FE Wiki listing all the archetypes. However, I've always felt that there were some recurring tropes that could be considered an archetype but weren't listed there. One such case is a Chagall. A Chagall is an enemy general who has a theatrical and overzealous personality and has an inferiority complex towards a peer. As well, that peer has a personal connection to someone who can be recruited into the player's army. That second part is especially important since it gives the player more personal stakes in whatever conflict the Chagall is stirring up. The characters who belong to this archetype are Chagall, Kempf, Narshan, Volter, and Exilus. Chagall is the king of Augustria, but lacks major holy blood, so he feels inferior to Eldigan. Eldigan's sister, Loxus, joins your party and eventually gets revenge for her brother. Kempf is a general of Friege who envies Reinhardt, and we frequently see him antagonize Reinhardt's younger sister, Olwen. Narshan hates that a foreigner like Gale can have the same title as him, but in this case we don't see Narshan interact with Melody much. He does try to sabotage Melody's brother, but otherwise doesn't speak to her. Volter hates, well, everything really, but he does go out of his way to kill Glenn and mess with Cormag. I'm kinda iffy on Exilus, but he certainly has a theatrical personality, and he does talk down to both Yenfei and Cyree at some point, so I'll count it. He's the weakest fit, but he still belongs here because his role is to be the obnoxious, self-important foil who inflates himself by degrading those around him. This is actually one I'm surprised hasn't come back. Volter, Kempf, and especially Narshan are all pretty popular for tertiary antagonists. It also makes for good melodrama since you're questioning whether the character caught in between will join you. It does a lot to strengthen the motivation of the character who does join you. I also think this archetype is really good at providing an emotional foil for various sympathetic villains in the series. The Chagall is smaller than the person they're fixated on, and that insecurity is exposed through every scene they're in. At the same time, the player gets a personal stake through the recruitable character connected to the rival. It makes the Chagalls both easy to understand and easy to hate. Next is an archetype that used to be central to Fire Emblem storytelling before almost completely disappearing. The Malladus archetype describes a tactician or advisor character in the army who is not playable despite their importance. The original is Malladus, a character whom even many series fans can't remember. He has a really strange presence in FE1, popping up randomly with no introduction to give Marth advice. The game makes really no effort to introduce him to you or establish any kind of character motivation. His implementation in FE1 is strictly utilitarian, existing to guide Marth and, by proxy, the player. FE3 marks this archetype's second appearance, and it makes great strides to make it more memorable. This time the Malladus is Jagan. Making it a formally playable character is smart. The Malladus doesn't need an introduction if we already know him, and it gives the player a stronger bond to the tactician rather than them just being some random guy. This is also where we start to see a common dynamic with this archetype, where the Malladus and the Lord go back and forth about strategy. Often, the advisor is practical and pessimistic, while the Lord is idealistic and hopeful. Though I do think his implementation in this game is kinda dragged down by Kaga's undying love for expedition dumps, but he's cool nonetheless. FE4 features 2 Malladuses, Malladai? One in each generation. In Gen 1 we get Sigurd's squire Aoife, and in Gen 2 you get the deposed King Levin. Having these two both be the Malladus at one point and playable at another works wonders to make them more compelling. You see Aoife's personal bond with Sigurd in his youth, which gives context to his feelings of obligation towards Seliph. Levin's sudden shift in personality and detached nature lends a lot of intrigue to the story and is completely recontextualized by the twist at the end. The archetype reaches its peak in Thracia 776 with Drius and Augustus. Drius is a Duke of Leonster who has guided many young knights, while Augustus is a shady former priest who was secretly tasked by Levin with aiding Leif. These two characters have completely different ideologies and pull Leaf in different directions. This even impacts gameplay since there's a point where you need to choose who to listen to, which impacts which route you take. They're also used to mark what I think is one of the strongest narrative moments in Thracia. In Chapter 18, after liberating Leonster, Leaf insists on liberating Ulster. Drius and Augustus finally agree on something, that this is a bad idea, but they give in and Drius agrees to lead the charge. Their squad gets crushed by the Empire, resulting in Drius' death. Having the protagonists suffer consequences for their actions is not something this series always does, so I like this. As well, the contrast of Drius being the noble-hearted knight and Augustus being a corrupt priest makes this hit even harder. I think it reinforces the brutal nature of FE5. This is the archetype firing on all cylinders. Drius and Augustus' clashing ideologies make you question what the right decision even is. It underscores how hard Leaf's journey is since he doesn't have a sole authority figure he can turn to for guidance. Once the archetype hits this point, there's really nowhere higher for it to go. After the highs achieved with Drius and Augustus, the archetype proceeds to plummet into the pits of hell with Merlinus, the worst character ever. He takes up an unbearable amount of screen time and never meaningfully challenges Roy. I really don't think it's reductive to say that most of this game's story consists of Merlinus giving bad advice and Roy just choosing not to follow it. I know he's kind of a meme now, but Merlinus is the worst instance of FE6's lack of original ideas. Technically, the next Malladus is Mark from FE7, who exists. He never actually speaks himself and is only acknowledged occasionally in the story. I guess it's a neat meta idea to have the player be the in-universe tactician since you are literally deciding how the battles go, but it doesn't exactly make for a compelling character. The last real attempt at this archetype in the series is Rodrigue in 3 Houses. You could argue that having an example from such a recent game should mean this archetype isn't dead, but he's the only example since FE7 and he's in a route deliberately designed to mimic classic Fire Emblem. And it's my video, so I'll talk about it if I want. Like most things in Azure Moon, Rodrigue is very traditional. He's an authority figure to Dimitri and advises him along his journey. Similarly to Drius, Rodrigue's death is an important character moment for the Lord. I like how 3 Houses uses Rodrigue's relationships with other characters to flesh him out. He's Felix's father and was at one point going to be Ingrid's father-in-law, but the tragedy of Duscur resulted in him forsaking both these roles to look after Dimitri. This further amplifies the tension between Felix and Dimitri since Felix feels jealousy towards him. This web of relationships makes him probably the most fleshed out Malladus. So why did this archetype disappear? I think it's mainly because they don't want to devote that much time to a character who's not playable. They may have brought it back in 3 Houses, but that was for the route designed specifically to evoke classic Fire Emblem. Otherwise, it's rare for any non-playable, non-villain character to get a significant amount of screen time. Players are naturally going to be more attached to the characters they play with, so it feels kind of like a waste of time to develop someone who can have that gameplay connection with the player. Despite the fact that many of these archetypes have been missing from the series for well over a decade, none of them are fundamentally broken. It's not like they were harming the game in some way and they had to be removed. So if Intelligent Systems wanted to bring them back, what would that look like? For the Axe Bros, I think they need a clearer gameplay identity. You can already see this in the Thracia duo or with Ross. Give them more interesting roles in combat so they leave an impression on the player. Making them actually fun to use in battle can go a long way in making them more liked. The Malladus is trickier. The core issue is that players don't connect as much with characters they can't use, and I don't think there's a way to change that without undermining the point of the archetype. Though we saw in 3 Houses that there's nothing stopping them from just bringing back an old archetype without any bells and whistles if they feel it suits the story. The Wendell would be the easiest to bring back. Fire Emblem and its fans already love growth units, and contrasting them with a pre-promoted mentor works well. Pre-promoted sages also tend to be well liked for how strong they are, so why not bring it back? The Chagall is another one that I don't think needs many changes to be worth reviving. It's proven to be successful in the past and it's far from overdone. Assuming it's competently written, I think the drama it brings can really enhance the story. For the White Wings, I think they have nothing to lose in bringing it back. It could make a lot of longtime fans happy, and I think such a dynamic group of characters could really land with newer audiences. It feels strange to have this discussion when there's a new game on the horizon, but we know really nothing about Fortune's Weave. It certainly doesn't look like a game that's interested in going back to the basics, but I would have said the same about 3 Houses just for that game to revive the Malladus archetype after nearly 2 decades. I just hope this entire video doesn't get invalidated by the second trailer, whenever that comes out. Fire Emblem's forgotten archetypes have been filtered out by the series' evolving priorities. Archetypes like the Axe Bros died not because they were bad, but because they never solved a meaningful gameplay or character problem that wasn't already handled better elsewhere. Others, like the Malladus or Wendell, show the opposite issue. They filled valuable gameplay or narrative roles but struggled against the series' growing focus on units the player can actively use and invest in. Meanwhile, groups like the White Wings demonstrate that even successful archetypes can be constrained by design flexibility. These lost archetypes show a consistent pattern in how Fire Emblem has changed over time. The series increasingly favors characters who are both mechanically exciting and form a strong emotional connection to the player. Even when an archetype works well in isolation, it has to compete against a broader design ecosystem that prioritizes customization and impact. So the question isn't really why these archetypes disappeared, it's which ones still fit the modern version of Fire Emblem. And as the series continues to evolve, any archetype that comes back will probably need to do more than just fill a traditional role. It'll have to justify itself through play, personality, and purpose all at once. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and comment, and if you want more Fire Emblem videos like this, please subscribe. By the way, I only mentioned it briefly, but the Fire Emblem Wiki, Enemy of the People, lists each member of certain archetypes. My problem is their definition of archetypes is kind of all over the place. Sometimes they stretch it too far, and other times they're way too restrictive. For example, they list Marcia, Tanith, and Lindsay as the White Wings and Path of Radiance, but I think that's silly. Every other version of this archetype is built around sisterhood, or at least a sister-like dynamic. Meanwhile, Alencia doesn't even interact with Marcia or Tanith. As for being too restrictive, going by what the FE Wiki says would indicate that Navarre has been dead since FE9. However, Lonku and Felix are so obviously meant to evoke Navarre that not starting as enemies frankly doesn't matter. While it does get some things right, I think it's inaccurate as a comprehensive list of archetypes. Anyway, thanks for watching, bye.